Video lesson 4.10, the bubonic plague. So today we're going to be finishing up our discussion about the bubonic plague, filling in a little bit of those details that we didn't really get to with our simulation, and also talk about the effects. So first of all, what actually was the bubonic plague? So any plague is a widespread disease. So the bubonic plague was the most common form of plague in humans that is characterized by the presence of buboes, which we talked about in class. So those were those swollen, inflamed lymph nodes in the armpit or the groin. They would kind of appear all over the body, be like bloody boils. So they would burst, and there would be blood and pus and really gross stuff. And of course, they were not very well taken care of, so those things would get infected, and victims, about 60% of victims actually died from the plague, which is not completely like immediately fatal, but in about 3 to 5 days you were likely to die. So it originated in China and spread across the Silk Road through Mongol traders. So if you remember that 2-minute video I showed you about the world civilizations, we have it originating kind of here in Southeast Asia into China. Then the Mongols had all of this territory, so including Saudi Arabia, including into Turkey and into parts of Russia. That was all Mongol territory. So the Mongols, as they were traveling through, it wasn't 20 Mongols, it was thousands and thousands of people. So it was likely that some of them had the plague or transported the fleas that had the plague as they were traversing this territory here. And that territory is the Silk Road. So we can kind of see how it spread into Central Asia here. So the Mongols spread their plague throughout their empire due to just simply contact, which was then, that empire was then dominated by Muslim merchants. So the Muslim merchants then contracted the plague. So by about the 1330s, the plague reached Central Asia, and then through caravan trade spread to the Black Sea, or this region known as Kaffa, and to Constantinople. So on our map here, where's my little clicker? Right here, this little gap is always where Constantinople is. So these two little pieces of land here, that's Constantinople actually spans those two pieces of land. So it reaches Constantinople in the 1330s, and then it finally spreads into Europe. Constantinople was a huge center of trade. Remember that this was the Byzantine Empire. So the Christian Empire, the Catholic Empire, was trading a lot with the Byzantines because they were friendly with the Byzantines. So through trade, we see it spread gradually. So the more red the color, the earlier it got there. So this band here is by 1348. Then this is like early 1349, and then 1350, 1351, all the way up into Norway and Sweden. The reasons these regions up here are green is because nobody really lived here, so they didn't really get the plague. And they're very mountainous, so it wasn't really a highly populated area. So it reached Sicily and Italy in 1347. So remember, this island right here is Sicily. That's where Messina is, and it was brought to that area by Italian merchants. Remember, because of the Crusades, we now have seafaring, so they could travel the Mediterranean Sea to get to places like Constantinople or Athens, or just North Africa and other places like Jerusalem along those major trade routes. So in about 4 years, the plague has totally taken over and ravaged Europe. How it did this so fast? One reason was they had very poor hygiene. They didn't really bathe, they didn't really have good waste disposal, pretty much, they didn't have indoor plumbing, so human waste and excrement simply went out the window and into the street. They also did not have closed sewer systems, so these open sewers would run through the streets. They also didn't really have a proper way to bury the dead. So once people perished from the plague, they were simply tossed into rivers. They couldn't really dispose of them fast enough or in a way that they knew wasn't going to make people sick, because they didn't really understand the science of the disease or the medicine. So they didn't really have this education or scientific understanding of germs. They simply thought that the plague was evil spirits brought with sailors. So, and they didn't really have a way to treat it either. So again, they did not know that you must change bandages to prevent infection. Simple things like that. Or not come in contact with the dead body because that would probably still have the disease. Things of that nature they didn't really understand, and so it was very hard to prevent this disease. This is what a doctor would wear when treating a plague victim. They believed that actually going up through this mask would prevent the spirits from getting into the this little garment here, and they basically wanted to totally cover themselves. However, they did not realize that many times they would still get infected because of their contact with the fluids of the body. This is also the time period where ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. If you've heard of that nursery rhyme, which I'm betting you have, that's where this comes from. People would put rings of roses, and it was also noticed that the buboes looked like rosy rings because they were kind of full of blood and they were round. So that's kind of where that comes from. And then pocket full of posies. They believed the good smells would drive the bad smells, posies are flowers, away. So people would carry posies in their pockets. And ashes, ashes. They would try to burn the bodies sometimes. We all fall down, we all die. So that's where that comes from. So this was not the only major outbreak between 1347 and 1341. There were also outbreaks in 1361, 1362, 1369, and so on and so forth. Eventually it does die out, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But in total, between 25 to 50% of Europe's population died, which is about 25 million. These are rough estimates. Pretty much every source you look at tells you something different because they didn't have things like the census. So there was no one that knew exactly how many people there were before and after the plague, or how many people died for that matter. There was no way to kind of keep accounts of that. So this is historians' best estimates. In some larger cities, they did have a higher accountability, but because people were living closer together with those open sewers and things like that, about 50 to 60% of the population was wiped out in places like Florence and Venice, Italian cities that were a little larger and more well-developed. And in England and Germany, some entire villages disappeared. Almost 40,000 villages just completely disappeared. And so, one more thing, back here on this little graph, you can see how drastically the European population dipped in around 1400, which is around the plague, right? And then we see it doesn't get back to where it was until about 1500. So for about another 150 years, that is how long it takes Europe to recover population-wise from the plague. So some other effects of the plague. The psychological reaction or justification to the plague was that the plague had been sent by God as a punishment for sins. That is the most that they understood. Or they thought that it was just simply caused by the devil, and some even thought it was the end of the world. So some people turned to the church and to God in very radical ways, such as publicly punishing themselves. There was this group known as flagellants, and they would go from town to town publicly whipping themselves to show how sorry they were and how awful they thought they were so that God would forgive them in all these towns. It also meant that there was increase in anti-Semitism. And remember, anti-Semitism is prejudice against Jews. So Jews were accused of being the cause of the plague, and many fled eastward to Poland and Russia because they were no longer welcome in Catholic cities. So just in adding on to the religious intoleration that was experienced after the Crusades, there was also anti-Semitism. Again, building on some of the foundations of the effects of the Crusades, there are economic effects of the Crusades. When you have a third to a half of your population disappear, the feudal and the manor system begins to disintegrate because nobody is left to work. So that means one person is responsible for the jobs of 4 people. So that means that they should be paid 4 times the amount, right? Wrong. So nobles become less wealthy because their price of labor rises, and they also have to kind of sell off plots of their land. Serfs are no longer necessarily tied to the land. There are definitely still peasants and still farmers who farm these lands, but there are also more merchants, more middle-class people. And nobles become less wealthy in comparison to where they were before. And so there's more of a distinction between the nobles and the king. So serfdom begins to decrease, but there's still landed nobility. Landed in this case simply means they own land. As a result of the nobility declining, the kings and the church gain power in comparison to individual manors and lords. And because the kings gain power, as opposed to the individual manors, nationalism is also on the rise. Remember, nationalism is the kind of pride in one's country. So we now see that Europe is broken up into large kingdoms. Instead of all of this kind of being fuzzy of where borders were, they finally decided, okay, this is the Kingdom of France, this is the Kingdom of the Holy Roman Empire, this is Poland, this is Hungary, this is the Byzantine Empire, this is Castile, which then becomes Spain in conjunction with Aragon, and England, and Ireland, and Scotland. So these kingdoms start to develop. And so now people are working together for the good of a country, and a country is a very new term. We haven't even really talked about countries except on our map quizzes in this class. So rather than being loyal to a lord or being loyal to a religion or being loyal to an empire, we have these kingdoms that are culturally somewhat similar, but are led by one individual king. So these are known as nations or countries or states. So there's no real definitive answer to how the plague ended, but some theories and factors include the development of quarantines, which meant like putting all the sick people away from all the healthy people and letting them just die. Or if you are healthy, quarantining yourself means keeping yourself away from anyone else so that you don't get sick. In this case, it meant that people would flee to the countryside. There are also increased hygienic practices. Some of these were accidental, so they knew not to avoid trade, for instance, and avoid actually touching the people. The reasoning behind it was not correct, but the effect actually worked. And they were kind of afraid of traveling, so this fear of the plague leads to less travel, which leads to the minimized spread of disease, because they thought it was from all these different traders and merchants in contact with other kinds of people, not realizing that it was the contact with the fleas and parasite itself. And that's all. Remember to take the quiz.